because we also need good conversion rates. This call is now being recorded. So, and the second thing, and the last thing is that we need side reactions. So we don't need side reactions. And that is what generally happens because we are producing carbon monoxide. And if we have side reactions and it produces any kind of gases, it will become very difficult to do the separation. So the objective that the paper is taking up is first to develop a suitable oxide. So in RWGS-Cl, oxides are used. So we have to develop a suitable oxide that is able to convert carbon dioxide to carbon monoxide. And we want faster splitting. Of course, everything needs, nowadays we want everything to be fast. So we definitely want faster splitting of carbon dioxide and at lower temperatures. So even at lower temperatures, we want the some efficient carbon dioxide splitting, which has not been seen previously. And this is the general structure that the general process, just a flow diagram. And here, this is the cycle that they are focusing on the RWGS-Cl, and they're focusing on low temperature, efficient carbon dioxide splitting, and simplified gas separation. So if we have lesser side products, gas separation will be easier in the end. So the question must be, why are we splitting carbon dioxide to carbon monoxide? Because carbon monoxide is also toxic. So carbon monoxide is a very important precursor to many chemical synthesis. It is involved in syngas. Syngas is a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. And a very important application of syngas is synthetic fuels and hydrocarbons through Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. So this is just, it helps us synthesize synthetic fuels, and we have methanol synthesis as well, which is an important industrial solvent. Another thing that we know carbon monoxide does is reduction of ores. This is probably from a 10th grade CBSE textbook. And we know that carbon monoxide is also present in metal carbonyls, and they are very important in coordination chemistry. So let's go into a little bit of background about the processes, and it'll make it easier to understand what is going on. So reverse gas shift, water gas shift, is a process in which carbon dioxide and hydrogen are reversibly converted into carbon monoxide and water. So this is a flow diagram for the process. Carbon dioxide and hydrogen enter the reactor. Heat is given to the reaction. That is, it is an endothermic reaction. This leads to a lot of reactions, splitting going on over here. Water is taken out so that it can be split again into hydrogen and sent back into the reactor. The rest of the gases are sent into a membrane separator, which help in separating. If there is any remaining carbon dioxide, it can go back and get recycled. And if we have carbon monoxide, we take it out. But the problem is we have a lot of side reactions, and the most difficult is the fact that this is a gas. Methane is a gas. So if we have methane along with carbon monoxide, it becomes difficult to separate the gas out. So there are a few limitations of this technique which we need to overcome. So what we do is we add chemical looping to the end. So chemical looping, so reverse water gas shift chemical looping splits up the reduction and oxidation processes into two. And for splitting it up, we require a metal oxide. So the metal oxide undergoes reduction in the presence of hydrogen, it is then in a reduced state. And then from the reduced state, it gets oxidized again through carbon dioxide and splits carbon dioxide to give carbon monoxide. So if you look into this flow diagram for this process, you can see that there are no side reactions. So there is no undesirable side product that is being created. The second thing is that because there are no side reactions, there will not be any need for gas separation, except for partially having to separate carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide if needed in the end. And that reduces the energy demand by 77%. So as I said, we need a metal oxide. So this metal oxide, they are called oxygen storage materials. And their properties determine the reduction rate, oxidation rate, carbon monoxide yield, and their stability uh, also determines what temperature the reaction is going to take place at. So let's go into OSM. So OSM is, there are two types of OSMs. One is perovskite types and iron-based types. And both of them have their properties and advantages, but at the same time, we don't know if they perform, we are unclear basically about their performance. They are not performing well under the 773 Kelvin. So 773 Kelvin is 500 degrees Celsius. And that because we are trying to split carbon dioxide so that we use it in sustainable ways, it would mean a lot if we can reduce the temperature in which the synthesis is happening as well, because it will make the process more sustainable. So this study focuses on copper indium oxides, which are efficient in the temperature range of 673 to 773, which is 400 to 500. We have come down about 100 degrees Celsius. So they have produced a copper modified indium oxide system by modifying copper indium oxide. So let us briefly look at how they synthesized copper indium oxide. So the first thing is complex polymerization to prepare copper indium oxide and indium oxide powders. So the copper nitrate and indium nitrate are dissolved in distilled water and treated with excess citric acid in ethylene glycol. There is a certain ratio that is maintained to ensure that we get the desired products. Then the solution is dried, pre-calcined. Further, it is calcined, and whatever powder we get from that, we do a wet impregnation method to prepare the copper-loaded indium oxide. So how the wet impregnation method is done is indium oxide is soaked in distilled water. It is stirred for 2 hours under certain conditions. Then copper nitrate solution is dissolved in the above solution. Again, it is stirred, but here under atmospheric pressure. And finally, whatever solution we get is our required product, and we calcine it to get the sample product. So further, what they did is they carried out RWGS. So the RWGS-CL cycle is what is being used to understand the whole reduction, oxidation, and splitting of carbon dioxide. So the apparatus used here is called thermogravimetric apparatus. This is a block diagram for how it works, and this is the sample holder, which is where we place the sample. We heat it to whatever required temperature we need. There is an atmosphere control, which allows us to maintain a certain atmosphere. If we want certain gases in the atmosphere, we can maintain and control that. And what happens during heating is, at such high temperatures, when we heat substances under certain atmospheres as well, which atmospheres also affect, this atmosphere also affects what happens to the substance, there may be loss or gain of weight. There may be loss or gain of mass, and this change in mass is recorded and is what helps us understand what is happening in the whole process. So a series of reduction oxidation takes place, and we try to find out how much of reduction and oxidation has taken place. So the amount of reduction will be the same as the amount of oxidation. So we call it amount of redox, and that is the change in mass divided by the sample mass into MO, which is mass of the sample pan, which is the pan. And what we do is we reoxidize it. So first we oxidize it. The air is entirely only hydrogen, which is at 10 volume percent balanced with argon. We first reduce it. We check the sample change in weight, and we find out this value. Then we reoxidize it in the presence of carbon dioxide at 10 volume percent with argon. And we keep on doing that until there is no increase in sample weight. So then at the end of it, we get average CO2 splitting rate, which is this amount that we found in the beginning divided by the amount of time it took to get oxidized from the time we started, carbon dioxide entered the system to the time there is no increase in sample weight into 10 raised power 3. So these are the two values that have been used and are going to help us understand why this system, this copper indium oxide, is better than others. And finally, temperature program reduction was done. Temperature program reduction is just ensuring that the temperature is maintained at certain in a certain way. And here we're just increasing the temperature 2 Kelvin per minute and going up to 973 Kelvin from room temperature in a 10% hydrogen atmosphere. And this is used in kinetic studies. Whatever values we get from here are used in kinetic studies. We will look at what graphs we get because we're using a TGA, so we are able to get plots. We will look at those plots when we get there. So moving on to results and discussion. So the first thing is we are going to check what is the performance. Why are we doing copper indium, and is it really performing better than the previous ones? So we are looking at this plot, and we can see already that this system of copper indium oxide is performing even below 773 Kelvin. This is the 773 Kelvin line. And none of the previous compounds have gone below 773 because they don't give splitting at that temperature. And the second is that we are getting very good conversion rates at high temperature. Even at high temperature, we are getting really good temperatures. We're not conversions. We're not going higher than 873 Kelvin here. So the temperature range is very narrow, and we are able to get splitting even at lower temperatures, which is the aim of the study. So if we look here, we can see the same thing is in the table, and it has been plotted. So from here, we can say that there is higher splitting of CO2 because even at 873, it is giving around 450, and this compound that is over here, which is of magnesium, is at 1100 Kelvin or even more than that. So definitely we can say that this is the system that we have, the compound that we have generated here is better than the ones that were previously present. And at this point, I would like you to take notice of this, the fact that in the first cycle, there is a very high splitting rate, whereas in the fifth cycle, it has almost become half of that. So we will come to why this is happening. So I would like you to keep this in mind. Okay, so here we are at X-ray diffraction patterns. So before we go into the patterns, I would like to explain what X-ray diffraction is very briefly. So this is a unit cell, and in crystalline compounds, we have unit cells which have planes. As we can see, this 100 is called a plane, and these are called HKL planes. And there are atoms in this lattice, in this unit cell, maybe at the corners, at the edges, in the center of the plane, in the center of the unit cell itself, because it's a 3D structure. And these planes, like the one that is highlighted, are repeated over and over because this is the smallest repeating unit. And this unit is repeated millions of times in the crystal. So when it is repeated millions of times, these planes, for example, this 100 plane, will be repeated that many times as many unit cells are there. And they will be parallel to each other. You can imagine another unit cell in front of this along the x-axis, and behind it along the minus x-axis. And we can see, we'll realize that there will be lots of planes parallel to each other. So this is how it will look, because each plane will have some amount of atoms on it. And what X-ray diffraction does is there are X-rays which hit the sample, and only at very specific theta values will it get diffracted. This theta value is not random, it is very specific for every plane. So for this 100 plane, there will be a very specific theta value, which will lead to diffraction and which will give us patterns. So that theta value is the one that we will record through the detector. We already know lambda, and here we will apply Bragg's law because diffraction over here follows the Bragg's law. And because we know theta and we know lambda, we will be able to determine d, which is the interspacing, the interplanar spacing. The space between these two, as given here, is the d. And this d is very specific for every lattice. So for this lattice, there is a specific d. For example, it will be probably a over here will be equal to the d for this lattice. So it is specific for each compound and each lattice. And from that d value, we will be able to determine what crystal is there. So we are using the X-ray diffraction pattern for this. And this is the pattern. This is the original pattern where we have prepared copper indium oxide. And as prepared, we have received this sample. As you can see, there are no peaks other than copper indium oxide. So this diamond, we have no other peaks. So that means this is pure. There is no impurity phase. If there were impurity phases, there would have been peaks other than copper indium oxide, which would have to be identified. So after this, we have reduced the sample, and we have reduced it, and we can see different peaks now. We can see copper, so I have just enlarged it here. So this is the copper indium alloy. There is a copper indium alloy peak, and there is an indium oxide peak. At the same time, there are two more peaks here, which are similarly copper indium alloy and indium oxide. So this after oxidation, so we have reduced it and then we are reoxidizing it. So we reoxidize it and we see another set of peaks. Here indium oxide remains, but we see a new peak, which is a copper metal. So these findings are important because we will be able to realize why they are in a while. Moving on, I would like to give a very short understanding of what STEM is. So this is a scanning transmission electron microscopy apparatus with an energy dispersive X-ray spectral photometer. So this is a handful, it's a mouthful, sorry, but don't get worried. It's just an electron beam hits the sample, and once it hits the sample, there is scattering. And those scattered electrons are recorded in the EDX, in energy dispersive X-ray. It's also known as EDS. So some of the electrons pass through the sample and some of them get scattered because of the atom present on the sample. So the property of the atom on the sample will determine the energy of the scattered electron. And for different elements, it will give different energies because every element has different structures. So it will give different energies for different elements, and those different energies can be easily understood once we detect them. So looking at the EDX imaging over here, we have this. So this is the reduced sample. After reducing, we have obtained this EDX. And from this, we can see over here, there is copper, which is entirely localized, oxygen, which is only scattered, and indium, which is uniformly present. Upon reoxidation, we see that copper, indium, and oxygen are uniformly distributed. So over here, in the reduced state, copper is entirely localized, but where it is oxidized, it becomes uniformly distributed. And this is the same, the D and C are the same as B and A, just they have overlapped them. So we can see that copper is very localized here, whereas here it is entirely uniformly distributed. So moving on to the next analysis technique. So with the same EDX images, they have binarized the images, and it has given them a very different type of black and white image, which tells us how much of copper is overlapping indium and how much of indium is overlapping copper. So from this itself, we can say that most of copper and indium are overlapping each other, but this gives us a more quantitative analysis of the same thing. So there's 84% indium overlapping copper and 93% of copper overlapping indium. Finally, we come to X-ray absorption fine structure. In this technique, X-ray goes through the sample, but there are some which are again scattered from the sample, and those are also recorded. So this gives a different type of peak. This is not to be confused with X-ray diffraction. X-ray diffraction is on the surface. Over here, there is transmission occurring, and the X-rays are able to eject out electrons from the atom. So for example, if there is copper in our sample, the electron in the copper atom will be ejected out because of the X-ray, because it is at such a high energy. So we will get very different we will get a very different pattern here, which is somewhat like this, but we will look at the pattern for this study. So these are the patterns. This is the indium K edge. What K edge means is K shell. We know K shell is for n equal to 1. So the K shell is, so the electron is basically getting displaced from the K shell. So the X-ray energy is so high that it is able to reach the energy of the K shell electron for indium, and similarly for copper K edge. So we can see that sequential changes are seen. When we reduce it and when we oxidize it, then we reduce it again, we oxidize it, we see changes in the spectrum very clearly. And that is because if you look at iron indium at third oxidation state, it will be it will have a more what do you call it? Nuclear charge will be more on the electrons because it has already lost 3 of its electrons. So the effective nuclear charge will automatically increase for the remaining electrons. It will try to hold on to its electrons even more tightly, and that will create a difference in the energy with which the electron is bound to the nucleus. And that is why we see these differences. In the indium 0, it will be at a lower binding energy, and in the indium 3, it will get a little higher binding energy. The changes in the copper K edge are not very significant. That is because after the first reduction of copper from copper 2 to copper 0, reoxidation does not take place. So the oxidation state of copper does not happen. So if you remember, we had seen this table in the beginning, and I had said that the first cycle gives twice, and the 5th cycle gives half of that. I mean, sorry, not twice and half, but there is a difference of 2 times basically in this. And why is that? Because in the first cycle, copper is also getting reduced. So that is creating a difference here, because splitting rate is either amount of reduction or amount of oxidation divided by the time. So in the first one, copper is also getting reduced. But in the second cycle onwards, copper is not getting reduced. It is not getting oxidized, so it will not be reduced. So copper, as we saw even in the X-ray diffraction pattern, we saw copper metals separately after oxidation. We did not see copper indium oxide peaks again. So we have been talking about copper. Why do we need copper? Is copper really needed? So the study also involved using 2 different other compounds, just pure indium oxide and indium oxide with copper, 10% copper on top of it. Not incorporated, like synthesized inside within it, but on top of it. And through the plots, so these plots are for 3 cycles at different temperatures, and this is the amount of redox. So the amount of redox we can clearly see here is very high for copper indium oxide, the system that we are using. And these are the 2 oxides that they have tried the whole process with. And understanding this is, just looking at this, we can see that this is definitely less efficient than copper indium oxide, and even pure indium oxide is very less efficient and even lesser than the one which has a little bit of copper on its surface. So this gives us an idea that yes, copper is helping us in this process. So we will look at kinetics of the reduction and oxidation, and it will help us understand very quickly about why we are about what the process, what process is happening during reduction and oxidation, and what is the mechanism. So we will continue to relate and compare between the three oxides. Um, so as I said in the beginning, there will be H2TPR, which is temperature programmed reduction. The temperature program reduction goes from 400, as we can see, from about 350 to 1000 degrees, 1000 Kelvin. And from this plot, we can see that for the copper containing oxides, there are three very broad ranges in which reduction is taking place. And for the copper indium oxide, we see this broad peak, which is related to copper indium alloy. And the model that is used for kinetic modeling is classic shrinking model, which says that the surface chemical reaction is what is the controlling step. And here we look at the Arrhenius plots, which is ln by 1 by T. And clearly, copper indium oxide has the lowest activation energy, followed by indium oxide with a bit of copper on it. And pure indium oxide has a very high activation energy. So clearly, we can say that copper species is definitely promoting reduction. Moving on to kinetics of oxidation. So the kinetic model is different for the copper indium oxide and the other two oxides. The first one uses a zero order model, which is that the oxidation takes place constantly till 60% conversion. So we will look at the B plot here, and this B plot, we can see that at 60% till 60%, it is pretty constant. But for the other two oxides, a nucleation model is used, which depends on the growth of the nuclei. So nuclei are generally, when a salt forms, they begin to aggregate together, and the aggregation becomes slower and slower as there is depletion of the material in the solution. So in this case, it's not a solution, it is a surface. So on the surface, indium is getting depleted slowly and slowly. And as that happens, the oxidation and the splitting rate of carbon dioxide decreases rapidly. As we can see, there is absolutely no place where it is even constant for a while. So this means that there are two different kinetic models, there will be different mechanisms for both of these. And even the Arrhenius plots here, we can see that copper indium oxide system has a very low activation energy as compared to the other two. In this, it is copper indium, the indium oxide with a little bit of copper is not even close to our system. There is a lot of difference. And this shows that there are different mechanisms which are being involved in the whole process. And from the nucleation model, we can say that these two oxides are actually using a surface phenomenon. A surface phenomenon is occurring here, whereas this one is not using a surface phenomenon. Otherwise, it would also have a similar graph over here. So what is the proposed mechanism for carbon dioxide splitting? This is what happens. So we are looking at the reduced state. We are looking at the reduced state of the copper indium oxide. So this is the copper indium alloy, which we spoke of, which we realized has formed. And this is the indium oxide. And when carbon dioxide approaches the system, there is a very fast migration of O2 minus. So O2 minus migrates into the bulk, and in the bulk, we have copper and indium. So we are not doing a surface process here. The surface remains in a very reduced state, and the carbon dioxide gets split into oxygen and carbon monoxide, and the oxygen goes, the O2 minus ion goes into the bulk. And from the bulk, it oxidizes indium to give indium oxide. So as we had seen that after oxidation, there was only copper metal and indium oxide. So that is what happens from the copper indium alloy. Indium gets oxidized to form indium oxide, and copper remains. So there is a highly reduced surface, and the inside is where the oxidation is taking place, and that is what is helping in the fast process. It is the reason why this process is fast, because it is a bulk process. We are not depleting the indium from the surface, because if we do that, it will be again, it will be a slow it will be not slow, but it will be a limited process. After the first layer of indium has been used, we will not be able to use the remaining indium which is inside the copper indium alloy. So it is a bulk process. Oxygen ion is going into the bulk and oxidizing indium from the inside, which is making it more efficient and ensuring that we can do this repeatedly, and even at lower temperatures. So I would like to conclude here. The first is that we have seen that this copper indium oxide is giving us faster splitting of carbon dioxide, and it is more efficient. Even at lower temperatures than previously explored, we are seeing that carbon dioxide is being split at considerably sufficient splitting rates. The second thing that we have seen is copper is indeed boosting the performance. It is helping in the reduction process, and even in the oxidation process, it is there with indium to ensure that bulk process takes place. And the splitting, when it is occurring from the bulk, it is faster and leaving the surface in a reduced state. So there is high reducibility and specific reoxidation mechanism, which makes this copper indium oxide perform very well in the RWGSCl. Even at lower temperatures, we are getting some carbon dioxide split. So thank you very much for your attention and for your time. And yeah, I would like to end here.
Thank you, Survi. That was a very nice presentation. So I'd open the meet for discussion now. So anybody has any questions or any comments, please you could type it in or just raise your hand. Yes, Advait, please go on.
Hello. Yes. Thank you, Surbi, for that amazing presentation.
Thank you.
This is not a question as such. It is like almost open for everyone, but uh, it's like, so this process does use hydrogen, right? So it is CO2 plus
Yes.
H2O gives your CO, right? But
Yes.
what like I have read is majority of hydrogen sources come from either like your hydrocarbons or from either burning and converting through electricity, like making it into electricity, or directly taking it. So that is somehow producing more carbon dioxide, right? So like it's an open question. It's not like particular to you, but is it like worth like doing this? So using this process, like, do we have any other approach of taking, making or how do you say, catching the CO2? Like, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I understand. I understand your point. But I believe that now we also have renewable hydrogen sources. One of them being splitting of water. I mean, it's not exactly renewable because, again, we need
Yeah, electricity, right?
electricity or solar power in some way. But yes, we definitely are moving towards a more renewable. And I agree with your point that it is needing hydrogen. So we will need a renewable hydrogen source to make the process, to ensure that the process is not
Dependent on
creating more,
the,
yeah.
yes, it is more green. Anyone can add on this, or it's
Yeah, so Rajit Manna says that it seems like efficiency of H2 as a fuel right now precedes the renewability problem. So that does make sense. And yes, we are slowly moving towards more renewable sources. That is true. Okay, so I have a question of my own. So we saw that having copper indium oxide is obviously increasing the efficiency. But then, like, what is creating so much of a difference? Like, what exactly?
Okay. So the main reason here is that we are having a bulk process. The in other processes, so as far as I have read, I have realized that in this there is a the movement of oxygen into the bulk is causing the process to be faster and causing it to require less temperature, because otherwise we need more temperature for the bonds to become weak and in general for the whatever metal oxide we're using to cause the splitting. But I realize that is not a very convincing answer. I will get back to you on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I thought of that too. Obviously, like in like why specifically copper? Because you said there were other compounds tried, and I saw somewhere else that no, except for copper, they were even trying for some other transition metal elements, and then copper still seems to have like way higher efficiency for some reason. Acha, Madhur says, Surbi, you talked about some X-ray dispersion instrument that can identify what element is present based on the energy difference. So how does that actually work?
Okay. So let me just go back to that slide. I believe this is the one. So no, sorry, it's fine, right? Okay. So in this, um, as I said, an electron beam hits the sample, and there are a lot of processes which are going on. The first is that the electron beam, it hits the sample and it is able to take out electrons from the atom. So it basically it has so much energy. The electron beam has so much energy that it is able to kick an electron out from the sample, from the atom, and that atom, when it is ejected out, it leads to a lot of other processes happening within the um, within the sample, because once the electron, so there are two things happening here. One is it is going through, this electron beam is going through. So when it is going through, that is the transmission. So we have scanning and transmission, both of them happening. So the ones that are going through are the ones that are transmitting, and the ones that are getting scattered because of an electron moving out from the inner shell and hitting other electrons, hitting other atoms, there is scattering. And that scattering leads to electrons moving out of the system. And that is what EDX is measuring, whatever atoms are getting scattered out. Does that make sense?
Yes, I believe it does. Advait is asking, okay, Madhur's thanking you. Advait asks, I would like to know more about the dash shrinking model. Like, Advait, could you like unmute and
I
elaborate
don't
on that?
remember the name. It was mentioned in one of the slides. Maybe it's further ahead. Uh, was some shrinking model. I couldn't note it down quickly.
It was the code shrinking model, as far as I.
Yeah. Where is it?
Classic shrinking core model.
Yes. This one. What is this exactly?
So I have not been able to figure out what it is either. I have not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay. It's okay.
Does anybody have any other questions or anything they would want to contribute here? So I believe there are no other comments. So yeah, thank you very much again, Surbhi, for your amazing presentation. Before we leave in though, let's all just turn on our cameras for once for a screenshot.